Welcome back, 5th graders. We're on Domain 3, Poetry. This is Lesson 7, Advice. Our objectives for today are to define and identify implied metaphors in a specific poem and revise previously written metaphors and incorporate them in an originally crafted poem. So there's only one key vocabulary. What is implied metaphor? It's a comparison that is not made directly. So this poem in this lesson is written by a speaker who remembers having a problem with his best friend, and his father gave him some advice, but it might not be the kind of advice the speaker expected. And as we read the poem, we should think about what that speaker problem was. But before, let's read his biography. This is Dan Gerber. Dan Gerber was born and raised in Fremont, Michigan. While at school, Gerber read the poem The Highwayman by Alfred Noyes and became inspired of the magnetic power of language. When I read that poem, it made the hair stand up on the back of my neck, he remembers. Gerber studied journalism in college and earned an English degree in 1962. His other passion was race cars, which he raced professionally until a crash nearly ended his life in 1966. During recovery, he taught high school English and continued to write. Teaching was pretty instrumental in my development as a poet, he recalls. Gerber has published novels, a collection of short stories, and nonfiction. His books of poetry include Departures, A Last Bridge Home, New and Selected Poems, and Trying to Catch the Horses. Gerber lives and writes in California. So I'll give you a few seconds to read through it. Feel free to pause at any time to reread the poem, because remember, it's very important that we read a poem more than once to get a better understanding of it. So what's the problem that the speaker has? His best friend said something hurtful. In stanza 1, the father describes a scene involving worms. What do the worms do, and how do the people in the stanza react to them? Well, the worms come out after the rain and people step on them. What does the father believe happens if people step on the worms in stanza 1? It stays a big mess a long time after it's over. In stanza 2, the father describes another way to act. What is it? Just leave them alone. What does the father say will happen to the worms if people act the way he recommends in the second stanza? They will return to the ground. Does the speaker start the poem with himself or with his father? He starts it with his father. So this was an implied metaphor. What that means is the father wasn't outright saying, leave him alone and he'll return. He was giving him an implied metaphor about the worms, that, if you keep messing with things, sometimes it leaves the mess for a long time and things get bad and you're probably not going to be friends. But if you just leave them alone and let them come back, a lot of times they'll kind of forgive. So that's kind of the implied metaphor here. So we're going to use the metaphors that we used in our last lesson. You created a simile and then transferred it into a metaphor for your assessment. So remember, revision helps us make ideas more clear and polishes our work. So you wrote an original simile and metaphor, but we're going to actually just revise the metaphors and include it in your own poem. Your poems are going to describe a common situation or action. If you're stuck, think of what are things you do in a typical day? You sleep, you eat, go to school, you ride the bus, you recycle, you do your homework, all these other things. Those are typical things you do in a day. So that's what a common situation we're looking for. So from my previous poem, my metaphor was the birds' flapping wings were oars dividing the air. So birds flying could resemble people. It could be traveling, it could be riding the school bus, it could be walking. Because remember, we're talking about birds flapping wings, which means they're moving somewhere. So that could be my comparison. Birds could also mean people are running away. They could be hiding. It could be that they're going south for the winter, being part of their life cycle. It could just be a flight, which is a big deal, that it might represent how people might do things in big effect. For example, recycling or doing homework may seem a little unimportant or short term, but it's important in the long term. So we can actually compare it to that as well. So I'm going to use the recycling as my comparison. So I'm going to compare birds flapping their wings to recycling a soda can. So these two things are similar because they both seem like unimportant things. Like we pretty much see birds flapping their wings all the time, and we recycle a soda can all the time. But if you do it all the time, it actually becomes something really big. So, for example, flapping the wings, or they're getting to a new place, and the recycling, remember, we're actually saving the world the more times we recycle. So it actually adds up over time. Even though it might seem like a second of throwing it in the recycling bin, it actually will change the world in a bigger matter. So in the last lesson, you wrote an original metaphor. You're going to use revision to think about how to use a different version of metaphor in a poem. You're going to use the same animal action. Instead of making a direct comparison, you are going to think about an action it could represent. So remember, you had already written one about an animal action. You have to compare it to a normal action. So remember, I used birds flapping their wings to soda, recycling a soda can. Those are my comparison. That's what we're looking for. Now, you're not going to use the same one I used. We want you to think of and be creative and see how you can change your metaphor and compare it to a daily activity and why it's special. So you're going to write down the metaphor from your previous lesson. You're going to list as many ways as possible that animal action could represent a human situation. So in his Gerber's poem, he used an animal action as a metaphor for a human situation. So he compared the worms to this fight with his friend. Those things don't seem as like they're supposed to be together, but they are. Then you're going to look over those ideas and figure out what you want to do for your poem. And you're going to describe in one sentence what you're going to compare in your poem. And you're going to explain how these two things are similar. Then you're going to draft. You're going to review your metaphor. You're going to compose a title. Your title should name the human action you are describing. So if I chose my poem to be recycling, that would be my title. Recycling a soda can. You're going to write your poem's first draft, because this is an implied metaphor. You're not going to state exactly what you're comparing. So your poem should not mention the human action. It should only discuss the animal action. And remember, your poem does not have to be the same as my example poem. In fact, it should be unique. So I'm going to show you my example poem from using the bird flapping their wings comparing to the recycling a soda can. This is not what we should see. We should not see a copy of this in your poem. Doing homework every night. Now, as you can tell, I did switch it up a bit, and I apologize. So instead of comparing it to the recycling a soda can, we're actually going to compare it to doing your homework every night. Now notice my title has to do with the human action, but I never mention the human action in the rest of the poem. So keep that in mind. The bird's wings flap over and over and over, each time only moving a few inches up, then down. The same thing again and again and again. The wings never go very far, and with their small flaps, the bird itself flies for many miles. So this is an example of that kind of comparison. It's comparing how homework is kind of mundane, and we're doing it over and over again, and sometimes it's just never ending. That's how we're comparing it in this poem. This is what we should see in your poem. You're going to come up with your animal action that you already have written, come up with the comparison that you'd like to use about something that's everyday life, and you're going to write a poem that's in this format. Reminder, we should not see this exact poem copied down, because that is not how we write our poems here. So just do your best to write your poem that's going to compare your animal action to your human action. And we'll see everyone in our next video.